The ship was enormous. That was the first thing Cole Warren noticed when he stepped out onto the deck of his cargo freighter at 2 in the morning, coffee in hand, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. He had expected to see stars. He always looked at stars on night shifts because there was nothing else to do and the ocean below was just black nothing for 1,000 miles in every direction. But tonight the stars were gone on one side of the sky. Not clouded over. Just replaced by something else. Something massive and dark and metallic that sat above the cloud line like a second sky had arrived while nobody was looking. Cole stood there for a long moment. He sipped his coffee. Then he went back inside and picked up the radio. He reported it in the same voice he used to report fuel readings. Flat. Calm. Factual. There was a very large, unidentified object above the Pacific Ocean, he said. It was big enough to block a significant portion of the visible sky. He gave his coordinates. Then he went back outside, sat down on a crate, and kept watching. That was how humanity's first contact with an alien civilization began. Not with a president making a speech. Not with armies scrambling. It began with a man sitting on a crate drinking lukewarm coffee, watching calmly, because there was nothing else sensible to do in that moment. The ship above belonged to the Intergalactic Council. More precisely, it was the diplomatic cruiser called the Eternal Accord, the flagship vessel of the Council's First Contact Division. It was crewed by 43 different species, all of them sophisticated and ancient and extremely professional. The ambassador aboard was a Valorian named Sekthan, a tall and thin creature with pale silver skin and 4 arms that he kept folded neatly behind his back whenever he walked. He had been doing first contacts for 63 years. He was very good at it. He had done this 412 times. The procedure was always the same. The Council would arrive in numbers large enough to be undeniable. They would position their ships in a way that communicated, without any room for misunderstanding, that resistance was not a real option. Then a translation drone would descend and deliver the terms. The terms were always the same too. The new species would be invited to join the Council as a subject civilization. They would surrender their independent military authority. They would begin paying resource tribute within 30 standard cycles. In exchange, they would receive protection, trade access, and the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of civilized interstellar history. It was, Sekthan always told new members of his team, a genuinely fair deal. The Council was not cruel. It had no interest in destroying the species it found. It simply needed them to understand the reality of the situation and respond accordingly. And every species did. Every single one. Because every known intelligent species in the galaxy, without exception, had something built into them that the Council scientists called the Capitulation Protocol. It was not a choice. It was not a political decision. It was something deeper than that. When a species encountered a force so far beyond its own power that resistance became genuinely impossible, something in the brain, something old and biological and instinctive, recognized that fact and submitted to it. The way a smaller animal goes still when a larger one stands over it. It was not weakness. It was intelligence. It was survival. Every species that had ever evolved far enough to reach space had that response built into them at a level far below thought or politics or pride. Sekthan had seen it hundreds of times. The moment always came. Sometimes it took an hour. Sometimes it took a few days. But it always came, that signal from the planet below, biological and unmistakable, that said, "We understand. We yield." He positioned the fleet. He gave the order for the translation drone to descend. He settled into his chair on the bridge and watched the planet below with his 4 arms folded and his pale eyes calm. The drone descended through the cloud cover. It broadcast the standard greeting on every known frequency and several that the humans didn't know yet. It entered the airspace above a large building in a country called the United States and delivered the message to an emergency joint session of world governments that had been hastily assembled in the hours since Cole Warren's radio call started a chain reaction that woke up half the planet. The message was clear. The terms were plain. The drone delivered them in every major human language within minutes. The world governments in the room heard it all. They understood it. The translation was not subtle. Then the drone went quiet and waited for the response. The room was silent for a long moment. Sekthan watched his senses. He waited for the biological cascade that would signal the beginning of the capitulation protocol. A spike in certain neurochemicals. A drop in aggression markers. A shift in the electromagnetic output of the collective nervous systems below. He had seen it many times. He knew what it looked like. His sensors showed him nothing like that. Instead, his communication array crackled, and a human voice came through. It belonged to a woman sitting at the end of the long table in that government room. Her name was Nora Voss. She was a mid-level diplomatic attaché who had been in the building for a completely different meeting when everything started and had simply never left. She was 34 years old, had a background in international trade law, and had drunk 4 cups of coffee in the last 2 hours. She leaned into the microphone and she asked, in a voice that was polite and even and genuinely curious, "And what exactly happens if we say no?" The bridge of the eternal accord went completely silent. Sekthan stared at the communication panel. Around him, members of his crew exchanged looks. The ship's head translator, a Baruvian named OTT, checked the translation twice to make sure it was correct. It was correct. Sekthan had served 63 years in the Council's First Contact Division. He had conducted 412 first contacts. He had read the records of every first contact before his time going back several thousand years. He had studied every species the Council had ever encountered. He had a wall in his quarters covered in commendations. In all of that time, in all of those contacts, in all of those records going back thousands of years, no species, not one, not ever, had responded to the opening terms of the Council's assimilation offer with that question. They had cried. They had begged. They had argued the terms. A few had threatened, which the Council considered a form of submission in itself. One species had responded with a song, which Sekthan still found moving when he thought about it. But no one had simply asked what would happen if they refused. Because the answer was obvious. Because any species capable of looking at the fleet above them and doing basic arithmetic knew what the answer was. Because the capitulation protocol existed precisely so that a species never had to find out. Sekthan uncrossed 2 of his arms. He leaned forward slightly. He looked at the planet below, blue and green and white, quietly spinning, entirely unaware of how strange it had just made itself. He opened a channel back to the drone. "Please inform the representatives," he said slowly, "that we will clarify." He closed the channel. Then he turned to OTT and said, in a very quiet voice, "Run the biological scans again. All of them. I want to make sure we are looking at the right planet." Vuoreth had 6 arms, pale yellow skin, and the kind of focused mind that made other scientists feel slightly inadequate just by being in the same room. She was the chief xenobiologist aboard the Eternal Accord, and she had spent 40 years studying the biology of newly contacted species. She had written the definitive academic paper on the capitulation protocol. She had mapped it in 70 different species. She understood it better than almost anyone alive in the known galaxy. So when Sekthan asked her to rerun the biological scans on the humans, she did it without complaint. She assumed there had been a sensor calibration issue. Equipment problems happened. It was not embarrassing. She would find the protocol signal buried in the data somewhere, point it out to Sekthan, and everyone would move on. She ran the scans 3 times. Then she sat very still in her lab for a while, staring at her screen. Then she ran them a 4th time. The results did not change. The humans had complex neurological architecture. They had a well-developed limbic system. They had stress responses, fear responses, social bonding signals, all the things an intelligent species was supposed to have. But the specific cluster of neurological and biochemical activity that corresponded to the capitulation protocol, the deep, ancient, biological recognition of overwhelming superior force, followed by the instinctive shift towards submission, was simply not there. Not suppressed. Not dormant. Not evolved into some unusual alternate form. Just absent. Vuoreth pulled up the biological profiles of every species in the Council's database. She compared them one by one. Every single one had some version of it. The shapes were different. The triggers were different. The intensity varied enormously. But the structure was always there, recognizable, consistent, the way a spine was recognizable across 1,000 different body types. It was, as far as xenobiology was concerned, a universal feature of intelligent life, as fundamental as the need for energy or the ability to communicate. And the humans did not have it. She wrote her initial findings in a short internal report and sent it to Sekthan with a note that said, simply, "This is not a sensor problem." Sekthan read the report in his quarters with the door closed. Then he read it again. Then he sat down on the edge of his sleeping platform and looked at the wall for a long time. He had never, in 63 years, needed to think about what came after the capitulation protocol failed to appear. It had never failed to appear. It was not the kind of thing that failed. It was like planning for the possibility that gravity might stop working. You simply did not need a plan for that. He made a decision. He would send a second message. Firmer. More direct. The first message had been courteous, as was standard. The second would make the reality of the situation more concrete. He would lower the ships. He would illuminate the weapon arrays, not fire them, just show them. Every species that had ever needed a second message had responded to that. It was overwhelming. It was undeniable. It would work. He gave the order. Below, on Earth, the response was not what he expected. Cole Warren, still on his freighter in the Pacific, watched the ships descend through the cloud layer until they were close enough that he could make out individual structures on their hulls. He took pictures with his phone. He posted them online. Within an hour, they had been seen by millions of people. The comments below his post were a mixture of terror, excitement, dark humor, and at least 40 different people making jokes that Sekthan would not have understood and would not have found funny if he had. In a government basement in the city of Denver, a woman named Dana Cho was staring at a piece of the translation drone that had been quietly retrieved after it finished delivering the council's message. The drone had been politely asked to leave. It had not been politely asked. She had an engineering degree, a background in electromagnetic systems, and a habit of looking at complex foreign technology and immediately thinking about what it could not do rather than what it could. She pulled the drone apart with the careful, interested hands of someone unwrapping a gift. She catalogued every component. She took notes. She started forming an idea in the back of her mind that she described to her colleague that evening as a very rude idea, which was the only description she was willing to give at that point. In a different building, in Washington, a man named Owen Garrett was looking at satellite imagery of the council fleet with the patient, methodical attention of someone who had spent 20 years in the military and learned never to look at a problem with anything other than complete honesty. He was not panicking. He had been in situations before where the numbers were very bad. The numbers here were extremely bad. But he was the kind of person who found extremely bad numbers clarifying rather than paralyzing, because at least they told you exactly where you stood. He started making lists. And in a small town in Ohio, a 17-year-old named Pete Calloway was sitting in his bedroom at midnight with 3 browser windows open and a star mapping application running on his laptop. He had been tracking the council ships using publicly available telescope data for the last 18 hours, cross-referencing their positions, their relative distances, their apparent formation logic. He was doing this because he was curious and because he was the kind of person who could not encounter a pattern without needing to understand it. He posted his findings in a long thread online at around 1 in the morning. By morning, the thread had been shared by 6 governments, 2 military agencies, and a retired admiral who printed it out and brought it to a classified briefing without explaining where it came from. Sekthan's second message was sent. The ships were lower now. The weapon arrays glowed with soft, unmistakable light along their edges. The message repeated the terms. It was designed, with great professional care, to produce in any intelligent creature the clear and unavoidable feeling that there was only one reasonable path forward. Nora Voss was still in the government building. She had slept for 3 hours on a couch in a side office. Someone had brought her a sandwich, which she had eaten standing up while reading a printed copy of the council's original terms. She had made notes in the margins in red pen. She read the second message twice. She thought about it carefully. Then she drafted a reply. It was professional. It was measured. It had no hostility in it anywhere. It said that humanity appreciated the clarification, and that humanity was still thinking about it, and that humanity would be in touch. She sent it. On the eternal accord, Sekthan read the reply. He set it down. He looked at the planet slowly turning below him, blue and green and entirely unbothered. He pulled up Vuoritha's report again. He read the key line one more time, the part where she wrote that the capitulation protocol was simply absent, not dormant, not delayed, simply not there, and for the first time in 63 years, Sekthan felt something he was not professionally equipped to handle. He felt uncertain. He sent a message to the council high chamber. He told them the contact was proceeding and that he was managing a minor behavioral anomaly in the subject species. He used careful, controlled language. He did not mention Vuoritha's report. He was not ready to explain that yet, partly because he did not fully understand it himself, and partly because he was not yet sure that the word anomaly was the right word for what he was looking at. Outside his window, the blue planet kept turning. Somewhere down there, a 17-year-old was updating his tracking thread. A woman was taking apart a piece of his equipment with her bare hands. A man was making lists. And a diplomatic attaché with red pen marks all over a printed document was on her fourth cup of coffee and already thinking about the next reply. Sekthan had never asked to visit a planet before assimilation was complete. It was not done. It was not part of the procedure. The procedure existed for very good reasons, and stepping outside of it felt, to a being of his experience and discipline, deeply uncomfortable. But after 2 weeks of sending messages and receiving polite, unhurried replies that said essentially nothing useful, he made a request to the Council High Chamber to conduct a direct meeting with human representatives on the surface. The chamber approved it with some reluctance and a formal note reminding him that direct contact before submission was irregular and should be kept brief. Sekthan took a small shuttle down. He brought 2 members of his team and OTT, his translator. He landed in a flat open area outside a city called Reykjavik, in a country called Iceland, which the humans had apparently chosen because it was considered neutral ground. The air was cold and smelled like salt and something else he could not identify. The sky was a heavy grey. The landscape was flat and dark and volcanic and looked, honestly, like it had survived something terrible and simply kept going. He found that detail quietly interesting. The meeting room was plain. Long table, chairs, windows that looked out over grey water. On the other side of the table sat a small group of humans. Nora Voss was there, with her red pen sitting on top of a folder. Next to her was a broad, older man with short grey hair and calm, watchful eyes. His name was Lou Briggs. He had been a general for many years before he retired, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had sat across from dangerous situations so many times that it had simply become normal to him. Sekthan sat down. He folded 2 of his arms behind him. He opened his presentation materials. He had prepared charts showing the council size, its resources, its military reach. He had records of every civilization it had ever absorbed, with notes on how each one had fared afterward. Most of them quite well, he was honest about that. He had prepared a careful, thorough, respectful explanation of why the human's current position was not a survivable one. He went through all of it methodically. He did not rush. He answered questions. He was patient. When he finished, Lou Briggs looked at him for a moment. Then he asked, in a plain and conversational voice, how many of those 412 civilizations the Council had absorbed had ever fought a war on their own soil. Not in space. Not with ships. On the ground, on their own planet, against an enemy that had already landed. Sekthan checked his records. He went through them carefully, because he wanted to give an accurate answer. It took him a moment. None of them, it turned out. Every single species had submitted before the situation ever reached that point. That was, of course, the entire purpose of the capitulation protocol. Lou nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already thought. Then he reached under the table and produced a book. It was old. The cover was worn at the corners. He slid it across the table towards Sekthan and told him to pick any page, any chapter, any section he liked, and read it. Sekthan looked at the book. The title translated, roughly, as a record of human conflicts across many centuries. He opened it to a random page somewhere in the middle. He began to read. He did not finish reading that night, or the night after. He took the book back to the ship and read it in his quarters for the better part of 3 days. He read about people who had lost everything, cities burned, armies destroyed, populations reduced to almost nothing, and who had then, somehow, rebuilt and continued fighting. He read about sieges that lasted years, about soldiers who carried on after their governments had collapsed, about civilians who became fighters and fighters who refused to stop, about a particular stubbornness that appeared again and again throughout the record, not as an exception but as a consistent feature of the species. He started to understand why Vuorith had filed the report she had. While Sekthan was reading, other things were happening on the surface. Dana Cho's laboratory had grown. What had started as a woman in a university basement with a disassembled drone had become a room full of people working in 2 shifts with proper equipment and a whiteboard covered in diagrams. The thing she was building had a formal name now, an electromagnetic disruption field, but she still privately called it her rude idea, because what it did was essentially reach up and flick the Council's communication systems on the side of the head. Not break them. Not destroy them. Just disrupt them long enough to be annoying and, more importantly, to demonstrate that it could be done. She tested it on a Tuesday morning, quietly, aimed at a very specific frequency band. On the eternal accord, The communications officer reported intermittent signal degradation of unknown origin in a routine log entry. Nobody flagged it as significant. It lasted 11 seconds. Dana looked at her readings, nodded once, and started scaling the design up. Owen Garrett had a different kind of operation running. He was not building anything. He was listening. His team, which now included a woman named Carla Sims who had spent 15 years as an independent network security specialist and had a professional reputation that certain government agencies found uncomfortable, had been quietly working on the partial decode of the Council's tactical communication frequency. They were not sending anything back. That would have been foolish. They were just listening and mapping, building up a picture of how the Council's fleet communicated internally, what the patterns were, what the timing looked like, where the gaps were. Carla Sims was good at finding gaps. She found several. She wrote them up in a plain document with no technical language and handed it to Owen with a sticky note on the front that said these are doors. He read the document, kept his expression entirely neutral, and then put it in a locked drawer and started making a different kind of list from the one he had been making before. Back in Reykjavik, Sekthan returned for a second meeting. He was quieter this time. He had fewer charts. He sat down across from Nora and Lou and looked at them with the careful, slightly unsettled attention of someone who has been doing a job for a long time and has just discovered that one of his fundamental assumptions was wrong. He told them, plainly, that he had read the book. Lou asked him what he thought of it. Sekthan was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he thought the humans had an extremely uncomfortable relationship with the idea of stopping. Lou smiled at that, not a happy smile, more the smile of a man who has heard his people described accurately for the first time by someone who had not expected to be impressed. Nora opened her folder. She had a new set of questions written in the margins of a fresh document. She uncapped her red pen. The grey Icelandic sky outside the windows was starting to darken toward evening, and nobody at the table made any move to wrap things up. Sekthan sat back. He looked at the two humans across from him. Then he sent a message back to his ship, rescheduling his return for the following morning. He had more questions of his own. Not everyone on the Eternal Accord was as patient as Sekthan. There were 3 sub-commanders on the ship. Their names translated loosely into something like Drovan, Kasek, and Jarl. They were professional, experienced, and deeply frustrated. They had been sitting above this small blue planet for weeks. They had delivered the terms twice. They had lowered the ships. They had lit up the weapon arrays. They had done everything the procedure called for, and the humans had responded with politely worded messages that essentially said they were still thinking about it. This was, from the sub-commander's point of view, completely unacceptable. Sekthan was on the surface again, sitting in that grey room in Iceland, having yet another conversation that had produced no formal submission. The 3 sub-commanders met privately without him. They talked for a long time. They looked at maps of the planet's surface. They reviewed the standard escalation protocols, the ones that existed below the level of full military engagement, demonstration strikes. Targeted, precise, designed not to kill large numbers but to destroy something significant enough that the species below would finally feel, in a real and physical way, what it meant to be on the wrong side of the Council's patience. They chose a location in a remote stretch of land in a region called Mongolia. Wide open. Mostly empty. No major population centers nearby. They picked it carefully because they were not trying to cause a massacre. They were trying to cause a feeling. The feeling that always came just before the capitulation protocol activated. The feeling of genuine helplessness in the face of something too large to fight. They gave the order without telling Sekthan. The strike lasted less than 4 seconds. A single focused energy discharge from one of the mid-range weapons arrays. It hit the ground at an angle and the Earth came up in a column of fire and dust and dark rock that was visible from 200 miles away. When it settled, the crater was 3 kilometers wide and perfectly circular and still glowing faintly at the edges. Sekthan felt the ship move slightly from the surface. He looked up at the sky. He knew immediately what had happened. He excused himself from the meeting table, walked outside into the cold Icelandic air, and stood there for a moment with 3 of his arms pressed flat against his sides, which was, for a Valorian, the physical equivalent of a person closing their eyes and counting slowly to 10. Then he went back inside and sat down. Nora Voss was looking at her phone. Lou Briggs was looking at the table. The room was very quiet. Lou looked up first. His face was unreadable in the way that faces become unreadable when the person wearing it has decided very clearly what they think but has also decided not to say all of it out loud. He looked at Sekthan for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that the meeting was probably done for the day. Sekthan agreed. He left. Up on the Eternal Accord, Vuorith had her instruments pointed at the planet's surface. She was not looking at the crater. She was looking at the humans. Specifically, she was measuring the biological response cascading across the population, the stress hormones, the neurological activity, the collective physiological reaction of a species that had just watched a hole 3 kilometers wide get punched into their planet by something sitting above the clouds. She expected to see the early signatures of capitulation protocol activation. Under this kind of pressure, even in species where the protocol was slow to trigger, you always saw the beginning of it. The biology didn't lie. The deep brain didn't argue with reality the way the surface brain did. What she saw instead made her set down her instruments and stare at her screen. The stress response was there. Of course it was. The humans were frightened. Their bodies showed it clearly. But underneath that fear, running alongside it and in some readings actually overtaking it, was something else. Something she had catalogued briefly in part 2 of her ongoing report and given a tentative label to, but had not fully understood until now. She understood it now. She opened a new entry in her research log and wrote for a long time. The label she had given the response before, directed aggression with long-term planning characteristics, no longer felt sufficient. What she was seeing in the human biological data was not just aggression. It was a kind of transformation. The fear was real, but it was feeding something rather than suppressing something. It was as if the strike, instead of pushing the humans toward surrender, had pushed them toward a state of focused, cold, organized readiness that had no equivalent in any species she had ever studied. She checked her data 3 times. It was consistent across every population center she could scan. The crater had not broken anything. It had unified everything. Within hours of the strike, governments that had been arguing with each other for weeks went quiet and started talking in different rooms. Military agencies that had been sharing information reluctantly started sharing it freely. Owen Garrett's budget doubled without him asking for it. Dana Cho received a message that her laboratory was being moved to a larger facility and that she would have access to resources she had not previously been allowed to request. Carla Sims, who had been operating with a small team in a secure basement, found herself suddenly running a department. Pete Calloway's telescope tracking thread was taken offline by 3 different governments simultaneously, which meant they were finally taking it seriously enough to classify it, which Pete considered a personal victory. Nora Voss went home, slept for 6 hours, and came back with a new document. It was longer than her previous messages to the council. It was very carefully written. She had gone through it 4 times and removed every word that could be read as emotional, because she wanted it to be plain and clear and impossible to misread. It said that humanity had noted the demonstration. It said that humanity understood what the council was capable of. It said that humanity also wished to make something clear in return, and what followed was a straightforward explanation that humans did not process that kind of pressure the way the council appeared to expect. She wrote that for humans, historically, that kind of pressure did not produce surrender. She wrote that if the council reviewed the evidence carefully, it would find that for humans, that kind of pressure had a tendency to produce the opposite result. She attached 47,000 years of archaeological evidence. Then she attached a secondary file. It was smaller. It contained 11 seconds of recorded signal disruption from the Eternal Accord's own communication logs, which Carla Sims had pulled from the frequencies they had been quietly monitoring. It was attached without comment. It did not need one. On the Eternal Accord, Sekthan read the message alone in his quarters. He read it twice. Then he pulled up the secondary file and listened to the 11 seconds of disruption, and sat with what that meant for a long time. Then he did something that no council ambassador had done in recorded history. He opened a direct channel to the council high chamber and sent a personal recommendation. He wrote clearly and without softening it that the council should seriously consider an alternative to assimilation for this particular species. He listed his reasons. He cited Vuorith's research. He referenced the history book. He mentioned the 11 seconds. The chamber sent back a formal reprimand within the hour. Sekthan read the reprimand. He set it aside. Then he wrote the same recommendation again, in slightly different words, and sent it a second time. The council high chamber was not a room that was used to being surprised. It was one of the oldest governing bodies in the known galaxy. It had seen empires form and collapse. It had absorbed civilizations that were ancient when humanity was still learning to make fire. Its members had sat through crises, wars, plagues, and catastrophic miscalculations so many times across so many centuries that almost nothing registered as genuinely new anymore. Secthan's second message registered as genuinely new. Not because of the recommendation itself. Ambassadors had occasionally sent unusual recommendations before. It happened. The chamber had procedures for it. What made this one different was the supporting material. Vuortha's full research report had been attached. All 42 pages of it. The Chamber's Science Division read it in full and returned with a finding that was delivered to the senior members in a closed session with no record kept of the initial reactions, which was itself unusual enough to be notable. The finding confirmed everything Vuorth had written. The capitulation protocol was not present in the human species. The biological architecture for it did not exist. This was not a malfunction or an anomaly or a developmental delay. It was simply absent, the way a color could be absent from a spectrum, and the Chamber's own scientists could not explain why any more than Vuorth could. The best theory, which she had included at the end of her report in careful, qualified language, was that humans had evolved in conditions so consistently dangerous, threatened from outside, threatened from within, threatened by their own environment and by each other across every stage of their development, that the instinct to submit had never become a survival advantage. So it had never been selected for. So it had never developed. Instead, something else had. Vuorth called it, in the final paragraph of her report, a replacement architecture. Where other species had a biological off-switch for resistance, humans had something closer to a biological accelerant. Pressure did not turn them off. It focused them. Fear did not lead them toward surrender. It led them toward planning. Loss did not break their will. It appeared, based on the data collected since the demonstration strike, to make it harder. She ended the report with one sentence that the chamber read several times in silence. It said, "Attempting to forcibly assimilate this species would be the most dangerous thing the Council has ever done." The debate that followed lasted 4 days. Several members argued strongly that the humans were simply an aberration, a broken species that posed too great an unpredictable risk to be allowed to operate independently in a galaxy that had spent thousands of years building a stable and orderly structure. Others, particularly those who had read Vuortha's data in full, argued something different. They said that the Council's entire system of expansion had been built on one assumption, that all intelligent species would eventually yield, and that assumption had just been proven wrong. That changed things. It changed the logic of everything. Because if the assumption was wrong for humans, it meant the assumption had always been fragile. It had just never been tested before. Those members argued that what the Council had in front of it was not a problem. It was an opportunity. A very uncomfortable one. But an opportunity. The debate was still going when Secthan sent a third message. This one was shorter. It said only that the humans had just successfully disrupted communications across 2 of the fleet's secondary arrays simultaneously, that the source was a ground-based installation in a region called Colorado, and that the duration of the disruption had increased from 11 seconds to 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He noted, without editorial comment, that the interval between the first disruption and the second had been 9 days. The interval before the next one, he suggested, would probably be shorter. The chamber went quiet. Then it authorized Secthan to proceed with alternative negotiations. He took the shuttle down for the 3rd time. This time he did not bring charts. He did not bring prepared materials or formal presentations or records of previous assimilations. He brought nothing except OTT, his translator, and the particular expression of a being who has decided to stop performing and start talking. The meeting room in Reykjavik was the same as before. Grey water outside the windows. Long table. Plain chairs. Nora Voss was there with her folder. Lou Briggs was there with his stillness. There were 2 other people at the table this time, Owen Garrett, who sat with his hands flat on the table and said very little, and Dana Cho, who sat at the far end with a cup of tea and looked at Secthan with the calm, assessing attention of someone who had already taken apart one piece of his technology and was forming opinions about the rest of it. Secthan sat down. He looked at the 4 humans across from him. Then he said something that his training had never prepared him to say in a first contact situation. He told them the truth. He told them what the Council had expected when it arrived. He told them about the capitulation protocol, what it was, how it worked, why the Council had always relied on it. He told them that in 413 contacts, they had never encountered a species that didn't have it. He told them what Vuorth had found, and what it meant, and why the demonstration strike had been ordered, and why it had been a mistake, and that the subcommanders responsible for ordering it without authorization had been removed from their posts. He told them that the council had spent 4 days in serious debate about what to do next. He told them that the debate had ended with a decision that had no precedent in the council's history. The room was quiet when he finished. Nora's red pen was sitting on the table, uncapped, but she hadn't written anything. Lou was looking at Sekthan the way he had looked at him in their very first meeting, with watchful, careful eyes that gave nothing away but missed nothing either. Nora asked what the decision was. Sekthan told her. The council would not offer assimilation again. What it would offer instead was membership. Not as a subject species. Not under the council's authority. As a full member, with a seat in the chamber, with a vote, with equal standing under every treaty and agreement that govern how the council operated. It had never been offered to any civilization before. The council had never needed to offer it before. The council had never met a civilization that made it necessary before. He told them that the terms would need to be negotiated properly, that there were processes and formalities that could not be skipped, and that it would take time. But the offer was real. It was authorized. It was the chamber's official position. Lou looked at Nora. Nora looked at Lou. Something passed between them that was not a word or a gesture but was nonetheless completely clear to both of them and probably to Owen and Dana as well. It was the particular shared understanding of people who have been through something very difficult together and have just heard that it is, in some important sense, over. Lou looked back at Sekthan and gave a small shrug. The kind of shrug that means yes, let's do that, without making too large a thing of it. The treaty was written over the following 2 weeks and signed on a Tuesday morning in the same grey room, under the same grey sky, with the same grey water visible through the windows. It was short. It was clear. Its terms were equal on both sides. Every person in the room signed it. Sekthan pressed his secondary hand to the document beside their signatures and held it there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. That evening he sat at his desk on the Eternal Accord and filed the final contact report. The form had fields that had never been filled out in any way other than the same way, 412 times in a row. He filled them out carefully, correctly, and when he reached the field that asked for assimilation status, he paused for just a moment. Then he typed the word declined and submitted the report. In Colorado, Dana Cho's phone buzzed on her workbench. She read the notification, set the phone down, and turned back to the machine in front of her. It was larger now than when she started. More capable. She had 4 people helping her and twice as many ideas as she'd had 9 days ago. The treaty was signed and that was good and she was glad about it. But the machine still wasn't finished. She picked up her tools and kept working. Because that was the thing about humans. They didn't stop when the immediate problem was solved. They kept building, kept improving, kept pushing forward into whatever came next, not because they were told to, but because they simply could not help it. It was not something they decided to do. It was just what they were.